When I landed the job, it felt like the start of a new chapter in my life. Everything seemed to be falling into place finally. I had spent years working my way up the career ladder, taking on underpaid roles and long hours just to get a shot at something better. This job wasn't just better, it was perfect. The pay was excellent, the benefits unmatched, and the office was sleek and modern, a far cry from the cramped cubicles I'd grown used to. Most importantly, it felt like an opportunity to grow, to truly prove myself in a professional environment that valued ambition and hard work. My boss, Mr. West, was part of the reason I felt so optimistic. On the surface, he was the kind of leader anyone would want to work for, charming, confident, and approachable. During my first week, he made an effort to welcome me personally, asking about my background, my goals, and even my family. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, which, at the time, I took as a sign of his good character. When he learned I was married, his face lit up with interest. "That's wonderful," he said. "Marriage is a big commitment. You must have an amazing wife to keep up with someone as hardworking as you." I took it as a compliment, though there was something in his tone that made me pause for a moment. I brushed it off. After all, it wasn't unusual for people to be curious about my personal life, especially in a new job. At first, things were smooth. The work was challenging but rewarding, and I quickly found my rhythm. My colleagues were friendly, and the team dynamic was collaborative. I felt like I was finally in a place where I could thrive. Emily, my wife, was thrilled for me too. She supported me through all the late nights and stressful moments, reminding me that this was what I'd been working toward all along. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice certain behaviors from Mr. West that unsettled me. He had a habit of dropping by my desk unannounced, often lingering longer than necessary. Most of the time, his visits were work-related. He'd check in on a project or offer advice, but occasionally he'd steer the conversation toward personal topics. He'd ask about Emily, about how we met, about what she did for a living. At first, I didn't think much of it. People in leadership roles often try to build rapport with their employees, and he wasn't crossing any obvious lines. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that his interest in my personal life, particularly in Emily, was unusually keen. There were times when he'd make offhand remarks that seemed innocent enough on the surface, but carried an undertone that made me uneasy. "She's a lucky woman," he said once, after I mentioned Emily's knack for cooking. "It's not every day you find someone with looks and talent." I laughed awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. It was the kind of compliment that could easily be interpreted as friendly, but something about the way he said it felt off. His gaze lingered just a little too long, his tone a little too smooth. Despite these moments, I told myself I was overreacting. Mr. West was my boss, after all. He had a reputation for being charming and charismatic, qualities that had undoubtedly helped him rise to the top. If he was paying me extra attention, I reasoned it was probably because he saw potential in me. Every once in a while, whether it was a client, a recruit, or a member, I would get something calculated in them. Then came the company events. Mr. West was known for hosting elaborate gatherings, from casual office parties to extravagant dinners. Attendance wasn't mandatory, but it was strongly encouraged, and I didn't want to give the impression that I wasn't a team player. Emily and I went together to the first event, a cocktail party at his sprawling estate. Walking into his home was like stepping into a different world. The place was massive, with high ceilings, marble floors, and walls adorned with expensive artwork. It was clear Mr. West lived a life of luxury, and he wasn't shy about flaunting it. The guests were a mix of colleagues, clients, and a few of his close friends, all dressed to impress. Throughout the night, Mr. West was the perfect host. He made his rounds, ensuring everyone had a drink in hand and a smile on their face. When he approached Emily and me, his attention was immediately drawn to her. He complimented her dress, her smile, even the way she carried herself. I tried to brush it off as him being polite, but the way his eyes lingered on her made my stomach turn. Emily, to her credit, was gracious but reserved. She thanked him for his compliments but didn't engage beyond what was necessary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. West's interest in her went beyond casual admiration. I could feel the repulsion and the sexual need. After the party, I mentioned my unease to Emily. She told me not to worry, that he was probably just being overly friendly. "You're his employee," she said. "He's just trying to make a good impression." I wanted to believe her, but a part of me couldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, the comments from Mr. West became more frequent. He'd ask about Emily during meetings, mentioning how much he enjoyed meeting her at the party. "You're a lucky man," he'd say. "She's quite the catch." The compliments felt less like small talk and more like pointed observations. I started to dread any conversation with him that veered into personal territory. It wasn't just the words he used. It was the way he said them, with a tone that suggested he wasn't just being polite. Such a change was necessary. I told myself to focus on my work, to keep my head down and do what I was hired to do. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became that Mr. West wasn't just interested in me as an employee. He was interested in Emily, and he wasn't hiding it very well. Looking back, I wonder if I should have seen the signs earlier. If I'd trusted my instincts instead of brushing them aside, maybe I could have avoided what was to come. But at the time, I was caught in a web of self-doubt and denial. I didn't want to believe that someone I looked up to, someone I respected, could have ulterior motives. It's strange how easily we convince ourselves that things are fine, even when our gut is screaming otherwise. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that Mr. West's behavior was harmless. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just wasn't ready to face it yet. It didn't take long for the dynamic with Mr. West to escalate, and his interest in Emily grew more blatant. It started innocuously enough, with invitations to attend company events. These weren't your typical office happy hours or networking mixers. They were lavish affairs that showcased Mr. West's wealth and influence. The first one was a cocktail party at a downtown hotel. The invitation was formal, printed on thick, embossed cardstock, a clear signal that this wasn't something to casually decline. At first, I saw these invitations as an opportunity to make a good impression. Emily and I agreed it would be a smart move for my career. She was supportive as always, encouraging me to network and make connections. She even helped me pick out a suit, and styled herself in an elegant dress that perfectly balanced sophistication and modesty. The party itself was overwhelming. The venue was stunning, with crystal chandeliers and an open bar stocked with top-shelf liquor. The guests were dressed impeccably, exuding confidence and success. Mr. West greeted us personally, his smile wide and welcoming. "Ah, you brought your lovely wife," he said, his eyes scanning Emily in a way that felt more scrutinizing than friendly. He complimented her immediately, his words smooth and deliberate. Emily, ever polite, smiled and thanked him, but I noticed how his attention lingered on her, almost as if I weren't there. Throughout the evening, Mr. West made a point of engaging her in conversation, asking about her interests and background. He seemed particularly fascinated when he learned she was a freelance graphic designer. "Creative and talented," he remarked, his tone dripping with admiration. "Ha!" said Emily when she was done reading her friend's notes. "You've got the whole package." I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was all part of his charm. That's just who he was, I thought. A charismatic leader who made everyone feel special. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the unease building in my gut. His compliments didn't feel professional or appropriate. They felt personal, almost possessive. After that first party, the invitations kept coming. Mr. West seemed to enjoy hosting events at least once a month, and each one was more extravagant than the last. Dinners at high-end restaurants, wine tastings at exclusive vineyards, and even a private yacht outing for the leadership team and their spouses. Each time, he made it clear that he expected both Emily and me to attend. While I tried to frame these gatherings as opportunities to network, the reality was that they were more about Mr. West's ego. He loved showing off his home, his wealth, and, increasingly, the people around him. Emily and I became regular fixtures at these events, and I started to feel like we were part of the display. It wasn't just his behavior at the parties that bothered me. It was the subtle shifts in how he interacted with me at work. Whenever he'd stop by my desk or call me into his office, he'd find a way to bring up Emily. He'd comment on how well we complimented each other or how much he enjoyed her company. At first, it felt like small talk, but over time, it began to feel more pointed, almost as if he were testing boundaries. One evening, we attended a dinner party at his home, a sprawling estate that could have passed for a luxury resort. The house was immaculate, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a perfectly manicured garden. The dining room was set with fine china and crystal glasses, the table adorned with fresh flowers and candles. It was the kind of setting that made you feel both impressed and out of place. As the evening progressed, I noticed Mr. West paying Emily more attention than ever. He seated her next to him at the table, engaging her in conversation while barely acknowledging the rest of us. He asked about her design work, complimenting her taste and creativity. At one point, he even suggested that she should collaborate with his marketing team on a project. Emily politely declined, explaining that she preferred to work independently, but he didn't seem to take the hint. By the end of the night, I was fuming internally. I kept replaying the evening in my head, dissecting every comment, every glance. I couldn't decide what bothered me more, his blatant interest in Emily or the fact that he was doing it so openly, as if daring me to react. Emily noticed my frustration on the drive home and asked what was wrong. I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid or overly sensitive. When I finally told her, she tried to reassure me. "He's just being friendly," she said. "He probably doesn't even realize how he's coming across." But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was deliberate. Mr. West was too calculated, too aware of his actions to brush them off as mere friendliness. He was testing the waters, pushing boundaries to see how far he could go. The invitations didn't stop, and each event seemed to follow the same pattern. Mr. West would make a show of welcoming us, directing most of his attention toward Emily while I played the part of the silent observer. It became harder and harder to ignore the tension, and I started to dread these gatherings. What frustrated me most was the power dynamic at play. Mr. West wasn't just my boss, he was the head of the company, the person who held my professional future in his hands. Declining his invitations felt risky, as if it would send the wrong message about my commitment to the team. But attending these events felt like walking into a trap, knowing I was willingly putting Emily in his line of sight. I began to resent the position I was in, the feeling of being cornered. I couldn't confront him directly without risking my job, and I didn't want to drag Emily into a confrontation that might only make things worse. Instead, I tried to limit our interactions as much as possible, keeping our attendance at these events brief and avoiding one-on-one conversations with Mr. West. But no matter how much I tried to avoid it, the situation was impossible to ignore. Mr. West's behavior was escalating, his interest in Emily becoming more overt with each passing week. It was no longer just an uneasy feeling, it was a glaring red flag I couldn't ignore. The breaking point came when Mr. West extended an invitation to a weekend retreat. Unlike the other events, which were single evening affairs, this one was a full weekend away at a luxury resort. It was framed as a team-building exercise, a chance for the leadership team to bond and recharge. Spouses were explicitly encouraged to attend, making it clear that this wasn't just a professional obligation, it was personal too. The trip was followed by weekend workshops at a local university where a membership was offered to all of the spouses with free dinners. Hundreds of spouses were gathered. When I first received the invitation, I hesitated. By this point, I had grown wary of any situation that involved Mr. West, especially those that included Emily, but declining felt like a dangerous move. The email was written in a way that left no doubt about his expectations. Attendance wasn't mandatory, but it was heavily implied that anyone who didn't show up would stand out. Emily, ever supportive, convinced me that we should go. She argued that it was important for my career, that Mr. West's interest in her was probably harmless, and that I was overthinking the situation. I wanted to believe her, to trust that I was letting my insecurities cloud my judgment. So, reluctantly, I agreed. The resort was as extravagant as I'd expected an exclusive property nestled in the mountains, complete with private villas, gourmet dining, and a spa. The kind of place where every detail was meticulously designed to exude luxury. As we checked in, Mr. West greeted us personally, his charm dialed up to full effect. He made a point of complimenting Emily right away, praising her outfit and joking that she made the rest of us look underdressed. The first evening was a welcome dinner held on the resort's terrace. The atmosphere was festive, with soft music playing in the background and glasses of champagne flowing freely. Mr. West was in his element, mingling effortlessly with the guests and ensuring everyone felt at ease. But his attention, as always, was disproportionately focused on Emily. Throughout the evening, I noticed the way he positioned himself near her, steering conversations toward topics that would engage her. He was careful not to cross any obvious lines, but the undertone was unmistakable. He was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push without overtly stepping out of line. The next day was packed with activities, hiking, team-building exercises, and a group lunch by the lake. Emily and I tried to stick together, but Mr. West always seemed to find a way to insert himself into our space. He'd strike up conversations, subtly steering them to focus on Emily's interests and accomplishments. At one point, he even suggested that she should give a presentation to the group about her work, framing it as a way to inspire creativity and innovation. Emily politely declined, but the suggestion lingered. It was clear that Mr. West wasn't just being friendly. He was making a calculated effort to keep her engaged, to draw her into his orbit. By the time we returned to our villa that evening, I was on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being manipulated, that every interaction with Mr. West was part of a larger game I didn't fully understand. Emily, however, remained calm. She insisted that I was reading too much into things, that Mr. West's behavior was nothing more than a mix of charisma and bad social cues. Of course, she was right. From the first moment we landed, I could see the vibration and bad social cues. I wanted to believe her. But the events of the following day shattered any lingering doubts I had. The morning began with a group breakfast in the resort's dining hall. Mr. West was seated at the head of the table, holding court as usual. Halfway through the meal, he announced that the day's schedule would include a series of one-on-one mentoring sessions with him. At first, I assumed these sessions were for the leadership team, but he quickly clarified that spouses were welcome to participate as well. After all, he said with a smile, success is a team effort. It's important to get to know the people who support us. Emily and I exchanged a glance, and I could see the hesitation in her eyes. The idea of a one-on-one meeting with Mr. West made her uncomfortable, but she didn't want to cause a scene by declining outright. When her name appeared on the schedule later that morning, I felt a surge of dread. I tried to convince her to skip it, but she insisted on going, reasoning that it would be worse to draw attention by refusing. "It's just a meeting," she said. "I'll keep it professional." As she walked away toward Mr. West's private lounge, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The next hour was one of the longest of my life. I couldn't focus on anything, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, and by the time Emily returned, I was practically vibrating with anxiety. She looked calm but distracted, her expression unreadable. When I asked how it went, she brushed it off, saying it was fine and that Mr. West had been polite. But there was something in her tone that didn't sit right with me, a forced lightness that only deepened my unease. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my thoughts consumed by what might have happened during that meeting. I replayed every interaction with Mr. West in my mind, every comment and gesture that had made me uncomfortable. It was like piecing together a puzzle, each detail adding to the growing picture of his intentions. By the time the retreat ended, I was emotionally drained. The experience had solidified what I had been trying to deny for months. Mr. West wasn't just crossing boundaries, he was deliberately manipulating the situation to suit his own desires. And the worst part was that I felt powerless to stop it. The drive home was silent, both Emily and I lost in our own thoughts. I wanted to press her for details about the meeting, to understand exactly what had happened, but I didn't know how to bring it up without making her feel defensive. Instead, I kept my questions to myself, the weight of my suspicions growing heavier with each passing mile. Looking back, I realized that weekend was the tipping point. It marked the moment when Mr. West's intentions became undeniable, and my ability to rationalize his behavior crumbled. I had spent months trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that his actions were harmless. But the retreat had stripped away any illusions I had left. I was no longer just uneasy, I was angry. Angry at Mr. West for his blatant disregard for boundaries. Angry at myself for not recognizing the signs sooner. And angry at the situation for putting both Emily and me in such an impossible position. It was clear that something had to change, but I didn't yet know how to confront the reality I was facing. All I knew was that the line had been crossed and there was no going back. Returning to work after the retreat, I carried a heavy weight on my shoulders. The weekend had left me more convinced than ever that Mr. West's behavior was not only intentional, but escalating. Every time I walked into the office, it felt like I was stepping into enemy territory, where the person with the most power over my professional life was actively trying to undermine my personal one. I began dreading every interaction with him, every meeting, and every email. The shift in my demeanor didn't go unnoticed. My colleagues asked if I was feeling okay, pointing out that I seemed distracted and tense. I'd brush off their concerns with vague excuses about being tired or stressed, but inside I was unraveling. I started to question everything, my judgment, my reactions, and even my worth as an employee. Was I overthinking this? Was I letting my personal feelings interfere with my professional obligations? Emily tried to reassure me, as she always did. She maintained that Mr. West's actions, while inappropriate, weren't as sinister as I believed. He's just one of those overly charming types, she said, attempting to ease my mind. But her words didn't help. They only made me feel more isolated. It wasn't that I doubted her sincerity. It was that her perspective felt so far removed from the reality I was experiencing. My paranoia began to bleed into every aspect of my life. I couldn't focus on tasks at work without thinking about Mr. West's motives. I analyzed every interaction Emily had with him, searching for hidden meanings or red flags. Even at home, I found it hard to relax. I was constantly on edge, my mind racing with what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. Things came to a head one afternoon when Mr. West called me into his office for a casual chat. I walked in trying to maintain a neutral expression, but my nerves were already frayed. He started with the usual pleasantries, asking how I was doing and commenting on a recent project I'd completed. But then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he pivoted the conversation toward Emily. "She's really something special," he said, his tone dripping with admiration. "You're a lucky man, you know. Women like her don't come around often." I forced a smile, trying to keep my composure. "Yes, I'm very lucky," I replied, my voice strained. Mr. West leaned back in his chair, studying me with a look that made my skin crawl. "It's a rare thing to find someone so talented and beautiful," he continued. "You must be very proud." The way he said it, calculated and deliberate, felt like a challenge. I could sense the subtext, the unspoken assertion that he saw himself as deserving of the admiration he was directing toward my wife. It was as if he were testing how far he could push before I cracked. As Ruby said, I wanted to confront him, to tell him to stay away from Emily and keep his comments to himself. But I knew the risks. Mr. West wasn't just a colleague. He was the head of the company, and any confrontation could have serious repercussions for my career. So I bit my tongue, nodding politely and waiting for the conversation to end. As I left his office, I felt a wave of frustration and helplessness wash over me. I couldn't keep going like this, pretending everything was fine while he continued to push boundaries. I needed to do something, but I didn't know where to start. That evening, I finally broke down and shared everything with Emily. I told her about the meeting, about how his comments had crossed the line yet again. To my relief, she listened without interrupting. her expression growing more serious with every word. When I finished, she sat in silence for a moment before responding. "I didn't realize it was this bad," she admitted, her voice soft. "I thought he was just being, I don't know, inappropriate but harmless. But this feels calculated." Her acknowledgement was a small comfort, but it didn't solve the bigger problem. We both knew that confronting Mr. West directly wasn't an option, not without putting my job and our financial stability at risk. Emily suggested that we start documenting everything: the comments, the events, the meetings. "If this ever escalates further, we'll need evidence," she said. The suggestion made sense, but it also felt disheartening. The idea that we had to prepare for potential escalation, that we couldn't simply address the issue head-on, was a bitter pill to swallow. Still, I agreed. From that point forward, I kept a meticulous record of every interaction with Mr. West that crossed the line, every inappropriate comment or action. The tension at work only grew. I found myself avoiding Mr. West whenever possible, taking different routes around the office and limiting my time in meetings. But no matter how much distance I tried to create, he always found a way to insert himself into my life. One day, he called an impromptu meeting with the leadership team. The topic was vague, something about brainstorming new initiatives, but it quickly became clear that the meeting was just another excuse for him to flaunt his power. He spent most of the time talking about his vision for the company, peppering in subtle digs at anyone who dared to question him. Toward the end of the meeting, he turned his attention to me. "You've been awfully quiet lately," he said, his tone light but pointed. "Everything okay on your end?" The question caught me off guard, and I struggled to come up with a response. "Yes, everything's fine," I managed, forcing a smile. He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Good. We need everyone at their best, especially with some big projects coming up. I trust you'll rise to the occasion." The comment felt loaded, as if he were implying that my recent behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. It was a reminder that he held the power, that he could make or break my career with a single decision. After the meeting, I sat at my desk, replaying his words over and over in my head. I felt trapped, like I was caught in a game where the rules were constantly shifting and I didn't know how to win. The weight of it all, the power imbalance, the manipulation, the constant anxiety was suffocating. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, but I didn't know how to break free. Every option felt like a lose-lose scenario, a choice between risking my career or enduring the slow erosion of my confidence and peace of mind. Emily continued to be my rock, offering support and encouragement as we navigated the situation together. But even her reassurances couldn't fully erase the fear that Mr. West would eventually take things too far, that his obsession with her would escalate in a way we couldn't control. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself in a constant state of vigilance, waiting for the next move in a game I hadn't agreed to play. The line between my professional and personal life blurred further with each passing day, leaving me more determined than ever to find a way out of the nightmare we had been thrust into. It wasn't a single moment that forced the confrontation. It was the accumulation of everything: the comments, the retreats, the constant undermining of my boundaries, and the weight of living with the knowledge that my boss had overstepped in ways that felt both personal and deliberate. The tension had built to an unbearable crescendo, and something had to give. By this point, my ability to compartmentalize was gone. Every day felt like a battle to hold on to my composure, to maintain some semblance of normalcy, while knowing the storm was far from over. I was no longer just protecting my career. I was protecting my marriage, my dignity, and my sanity. The breaking point came on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. I was at my desk, trying to focus on a report, when an email from Mr. West popped into my inbox. The subject line was innocuous enough as "quick check-in," but my stomach churned as I clicked it open. The email was brief, inviting Emily and me to an upcoming dinner he was hosting for a select group of employees and their spouses. It wasn't the invitation itself that set me off, it was the language he used, the way he phrased it, as though our attendance was a given, as though he had some claim to our time and presence. It was the final straw. I could no longer rationalize his behavior or dismiss it as mere charm gone awry. This wasn't about miscommunication or differing perspectives. This was a deliberate campaign of manipulation, and I was done being a passive participant. When I showed the email to Emily, her expression hardened. "This isn't okay," she said firmly. "We need to do something." Her resolve bolstered mine, and together we decided it was time to take action. The first step was reaching out to HR. It was a decision I didn't take lightly. Going against Mr. West felt like walking into a lion's den, but I knew we couldn't handle this alone anymore. I scheduled a confidential meeting with the head of HR, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, who had a reputation for fairness and discretion. Sitting in her office, I felt a mix of fear and relief as I laid everything out. The comments, the retreats, the meeting schedules, and the relentless focus on Emily. I didn't sugarcoat anything, but I also made sure to stick to the facts, presenting the situation as objectively as possible. Linda listened intently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression serious. "This is a significant concern," she said. "I'll need to look into this further, but I want you to know that we take these matters very seriously." Her words were reassuring, but they also felt like the start of something bigger. Filing a formal complaint against the CEO wasn't a small step. It was a seismic shift, one that could have repercussions for everyone involved. The days that followed were a blur of meetings and documentation. Linda asked for every piece of evidence I had, from emails to meeting notes, and Emily provided her own account of the interactions she'd experienced. It was exhausting and emotionally draining, but it also felt like we were finally taking back some control. Before long, the clinic on the opposite side of our neighborhood became my target. Meanwhile, Mr. West seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He continued to operate as though nothing had changed, his charm and confidence unwavering. But I noticed small shifts, whispers in the hallways, sidelong glances from colleagues who seemed to know something was up. Eventually, Linda informed me that an external investigation would be conducted. She assured me that the process would be impartial and that my job was secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling of walking on a tightrope. The investigation was a double-edged sword. It was our best chance at holding Mr. West accountable, but it also put us in a vulnerable position. As the weeks passed, the investigation unfolded in ways I hadn't anticipated. Other employees came forward with their own stories, adding weight to the case against Mr. West. It was both validating and disheartening to learn that I wasn't the only one who had been affected by his behavior. Eventually, the findings were presented to the board of directors. I wasn't privy to the details of those meetings, but I knew they were critical. The board held the power to determine Mr. West's fate, and their decision would have far-reaching consequences. My mind played tricks on me. When the announcement finally came, it felt so real. Mr. West was stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. The official statement framed it as a voluntary decision, citing a desire to pursue new opportunities. But everyone knew the truth. The investigation had exposed his misconduct, and he was being quietly removed to avoid further scandal. End footnote. The relief I felt was immense, but it was also tempered by the lingering effects of everything we'd been through. The experience had left scars on my confidence, on my trust, and on my sense of safety in the workplace. It would take time to rebuild, to move forward without the shadow of Mr. West looming over us. Emily and I emerged from the ordeal stronger than before, our relationship fortified by the challenges we'd faced together. We'd been tested in ways we never could have anticipated, but we'd come out on the other side with a deeper understanding of each other and of what truly mattered. Looking back, I realized that standing up to Mr. West wasn't just about protecting ourselves. It was about setting boundaries and refusing to accept behavior that undermined our values. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying this far and no further. The experience taught me that even in the face of power imbalances, there are ways to fight back, to reclaim agency and demand accountability. It wasn't an easy lesson, and it came at a significant cost, but it was one I wouldn't trade for anything. As I settled into a new chapter of my career, I carried those lessons with me, determined to create a future where respect and integrity were non-negotiable. And though the scars of the past remained, they served as a reminder of what we'd overcome, a testament to the resilience and strength that had carried us through.